Greetings, everyone. This week we are looking at the life and philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was born in 1813 on the 5th of May in Copenhagen, Denmark. He was the son of a wealthy businessman who had him older in his life with his mistress around the time that his first wife was still on her deathbed. Søren came into life with the last name of Kierkegaard, churchyard, because his father's family had come from a remote town in Denmark where the father's family worked for the priest. Søren's father, Kierkegaard Sr., was called down to Copenhagen to inherit his uncle's business, and through that became wealthy and an influential member of society, even surviving the hardships of the economic crash and the British bombardment of Copenhagen. Throughout all of this, Søren's father remained faithful to his Christian beliefs and tried to instill those in young Søren as he wanted him to become a pastor in the Church of Denmark. So while Kierkegaard Sr. was in his 60s, and young Søren was only 7 years old, he began teaching him logic and preparing him to be a pastor in the church. The Denmark of Kierkegaard's day was a collaborative church-state society, and it offered a Christendom which Kierkegaard would come to despise, as we shall see. Kierkegaard was an introvert in a society of individualism. The divided black and white boxes of individual life rear their head in Kierkegaard's existential philosophy. He went on to school to study theology, following his father's wishes to prepare to be a pastor in the church, but in the process became intrigued by philosophy, namely that of Hegel. Kierkegaard's writings can rightly be seen as a fundamental critique of Hegelian philosophy. Whereas Hegel's philosophy emphasizes an absolute idealism in which dichotomies are overcome and objectivity reigns, Kierkegaard's seminal 2-volume work titled Either Or displays the antithetical nature of his philosophy compared to that of Hegel. Kierkegaard says that life is fundamentally made up of choices, and not in a Hegelian sense of an evolution of consciousness, but in a fundamental difference of life depending on the choices one makes. One is who one is based on choices. Humans are free to choose, but one must choose who to be. That is, one cannot choose to not choose who to be, because our choices are made through our actions. Kierkegaard believes life is found in the tension between two poles, two ways of being, an aesthetic and the ethical. The aesthetic life is one of immediacy, of living in the moment. It is enjoying unconsciously, living into one's nature, and is ultimately finite and fragmentary. The ethical life, on the other hand, is one of reflection, of being about the business of self-creation. It is knowingly acting on one's freedom and is radically infinite and continuous. The choices one makes in these dichotomies are themselves also found in dichotomies. One who is living in an aesthetic life chooses between interesting and boring. And it's worth noting here that Kierkegaard believes boredom is the root of all sin, though that's another point for another lecture. One living an ethical life, on the other hand, chooses between good and evil. That doesn't mean one always chooses the good, but that the ethical person makes choices within that dichotomy. Ultimately, the ethical person gives up the futile project of simply trying to be something and takes up the project of becoming something, becoming a self. We'll discuss what the self is in a moment. Returning to the basic question of whether one lives an aesthetic or ethical life, it could be said that one is choosing to live more like an unthinking brute, or perhaps as reflective as God. It's here worth noting that Kierkegaard wrote in his text using pseudonyms, offering a variety of authors, some of which are listed here, though it seems everyone in Copenhagen knew who the mastermind behind the pseudonyms was. But in doing so, he allowed the readers all of these different personas in which they could relate and hopefully be awoken to self-examination. He calls this technique indirect communication. Norman Melkert notes that Kierkegaard does this in an attempt to, quote, prove the shock of self-recognition by offering characters with which the reader may identify and then revealing slowly but inexorable what living in that way means, unquote. This is one of the ways in which Kierkegaard displays his belief that all choices are made on a level plane. There is no right or wrong in choosing aesthetic or ethical, or otherwise, as we will discuss presently. Kierkegaard notes that there is perhaps another category in which one could live, one which transcends the dichotomy, which is the life of faith. He offers the story of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice Isaac as the epitome of faith, thus explaining why Abraham is known as the father of faith, or the faithful one. The conscious decision of Abraham to walk 3 days, knowing that he was called to do this act of lifting the knife to sacrifice his son, that would put him categorically into the realm of ethical living, choosing perhaps the evil, murderous choice of sacrificing his son. But yet it was the right choice because of his relationship with God. This right relatedness to God allowed Abraham to live a truly faithful life. The life of faith is one of risk. Literally, Kierkegaard referred to making choices of faith as being leaps of faith, leaps out of good reason and of good knowledge. Yet this risky life is what allows one to truly transcend the binary of aesthetic or ethical. In all one does, an individual is to be becoming oneself. However, Kierkegaard here reveals that the self is actually a synthesis of all of one's choices. He writes, through the character of a super Christian, writing as anti the climber, and this climber is one who claims to have known Christianity, but without being it, this subject-object divide. He writes, quote, the self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in relation which is itself relating to itself. The self is not the relation, but the relations relating to itself. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity, unquote. Becoming oneself, though, is risky, because there is no objective certainty as to what one will become by any of the choices one makes. One only knows from one's current perspective. One must accept the risk and live into Christ-likeness, trusting in the forgiveness of sin. And Kierkegaard writes that there is a state outside of the proper state of self-relation, and he calls that the state of despair. And he names that state of despair as being the very definition of sin, an antithesis to the life of faith, the faith which is self-knowing and also yet being in right relationship with God. Sin is not a rule-breaking, because remember, all choices are equal. Rather, sin is not being willing, not choosing to be oneself. which is a sickness that leads to the death of the self. Kierkegaard believes Christianity stands out among all of the religions because it tells humanity that we are sinners. This religiousness B is unique to Christianity, as a basic religious consciousness, or religiousness A, is common to all pagans, from Socrates to the Old Testament patriarchs, including Abraham, the faithful one. Christianity for Kierkegaard is not a status, and this is what sets Kierkegaard opposed to the empire of Christendom in which he found himself. Kierkegaard realizes that to know what it means to be Christian assumes that one knows what it means to be human. Kierkegaard holds this in tandem with his belief that the whole of human existence is opposed to God. He bases this belief in what is central to his theology and his psychology, which is the fall. It is the fall where egotism, as manifested in sex, reveals the lapse from grace in which humanity finds itself. Kierkegaard arrives in this position after years of an estranged relationship with a former fiancée, the details of which go beyond the scope of this presentation, except to note that later in his life, Kierkegaard, in displaying the fall narrative, believes woman to be the personification of egoism, therefore making celibacy, which is the antithesis to the egotistic sex of the two becoming one, is God's will. And humanity cannot be fully faithful as long as it exists through sex. Therefore, humans, should be modeled by Christians, should be celibate until the human race dies out. One may point out here that there are a few issues with this position, but one in so doing might discover that Kierkegaard, after running out of his late father's money in his 40s, just years before his death in 1855, realizes that his only career could be that of a pastor. And yet the Church of Denmark, which is the state religion in this Christendom, teaches that pastors should be married, and thus Kierkegaard is left in a moral predicament. As his life nears its end, he decides to start a new publication called The Moment, to expose the charade which the Church of Denmark calls Christianity. Kierkegaard is adamant that he wants to clarify that Christianity is not the equivalent of being, to quote Melkert once more, the average bourgeois life of a citizen in the state church country where everyone is baptized as a matter of course. Unquote. Christianity is not a matter of choosing church membership or orthodox beliefs, but of choosing to act in the way of faith. This belief undermines the Christendom in which Kierkegaard found himself, in which he chose what he believed to be his faithful choice, which was to call the church to recognize that it cannot be Christian in name only, but that it must act as Christian, to trust in the risky faith of Christ-likeness. The empire does not get to say that it is Christian. Rather, Christianity is found in the myriad faithful possibilities which Christians individually choose. Now, much more could be noted about Kierkegaard's life and his philosophy that does not fit within the scope of this presentation. So I look forward to engaging in the forum with you to discuss this presentation, the life and philosophy of Kierkegaard, as we come to understand how Christendom and the broader understanding of empire and church interact. Thanks.